Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. We are not far away now from the biggest overhaul in the Formula 1 regulations for well over a decade, but rumour has it today they're absolutely terrible. Simulation data suggests the cars are practically undrivable in their current form and will be slower than Formula 2 if these current regulations go ahead as they are. Why do the FIA keep making these terrible decisions? Will the manufacturers, the teams and the fans live to regret the decisions that Formula 1, Liberty Media and the FIA have made over the last few years? Very much into your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. First of all, rumour has it we may be going back to South Korea 2026-2027. Apparently, there is a letter of intent indicating a potential return of the Korean Grand Prix, round 25 on the F1 calendar. So, for all Stefano Domenicali might say, and Formula 1 might say, well, no, 24's the limit, guys. We're definitely not doing any more than that. Well, we'll see about that over the next couple of years. On the driver market as well, we saw yesterday that Carlos Sainz is absolutely on the radar of Aston Martin. It seems Aston Martin looking to move rather quickly here. They want Newey as well, apparently, let's not forget, and they're looking for Carlos Sainz in addition. Sainz, I guess, has some questions to answer because Red Bull, if they do try and get Sainz, will not move as quickly as Aston Martin seem to be, and therefore Sainz has to kind of weigh out, well, if there's an Aston Martin offer on the table here, does he sign that or does he wait out on the hope of getting the Red Bull seat? That might be wise in due course, but of course the big question we raised yesterday was if Sainz goes to Aston, is that for Stroll or is that actually for Fernando Alonso, which is apparently the more likely of the two as we talked about yesterday. Now, speaking of a couple of guys that may get involved in this, Prema Racing, you guys are familiar with Prema, pretty much the dominant force at some point at least of Formula 2 and more junior series for several years. They've always really been the team you want to drive for in the Formula series. Right now, of course, in Andrea Kimi Antonelli and Ollie Behrman, who are the F2 drivers for Prema this season. They are going to join IndyCar from 2025, which is actually really exciting as someone that follows both motorsports relatively closely at this point, and it was confirmed today. Prema will make its series debut with a two-car program from 2025 and beyond. Question is, who are their drivers going to be? Théo Pourchaire, Formula 2 champion from last year, but, you know, given the state of the sport, was not getting an opportunity anywhere on the grid. And it must be said that given what Ollie Behrman did in that Ferrari in Jeddah, it has, I think, changed the perception of some of the teams on putting rookies in the car. I think it's quite clear now to some teams that, yeah, you know what, putting some of these guys in the machinery maybe makes more sense because the drivers are cheaper and maybe have more potential than some of the veterans that have been kicking around the sport for quite some time. And, you know, maybe I'm not going to name any names on that one, but Théo Pourchaire, he may well drive in IndyCar very shortly. If David Malukas can't get back from an injury, so that would be interesting to see. And also, rumour has it that Prema are looking for a very specific driver lineup. Now, feel free to speculate on what you think they're going to try here in IndyCar, because I know there's been talk about, well, you know, is it time for Daniel Ricciardo, for example, to go over there to Indy, and, you know, that could be the next step of his career. I don't know if he would do that. Don't know if I want to see that, but it's an option. You know, Grosjean, of course, did that a few years ago now, but the rumour has it that their team is understood to be interested in pairing an IndyCar veteran, so that could be a lot of different people, with a young talent that it has developed on its ladder to Formula 1. So there's lots of options there of people that have been in the Prema program. Technically, Lance Stroll, I guess, could be one of them, but I'm not really sure that would be the plan. But I don't know, maybe if Sainz was to go to Aston, Alonso was to stay, that could be an option. But I feel like if Stroll was to leave Formula 1, he's probably more likely to go to WEC or something than go to IndyCar, but maybe that's a thing to consider. But also, in terms of more recent eras, Vesti, who did a good job for Prema last year, Frederick Vesti, of course, Mercedes guy, that could be a thing. There's a few other options as well, of course. Too many possibilities really to read into just that one statement. But quickly on the cars, Charles Leclerc and the tyre degradation. According to the data, the tyre deg on the Ferrari was basically zero on this car, which is unbelievably impressive around a circuit such as Suzuka. I guess the question for Ferrari is, can they actually find a better balance now between their race trim and their race pace and their qualifying pace? Because they were very fast in the race with like barely any degradation with respect to how we know how good Red Bull are around that specific circuit. But yet right now they're kind of slow in qualifying, right? Which has not been their problem for the last couple of years. Aston Martin as well, they had very little tyre degradation either, at least in the hands of Fernando Alonso. That was the question, right? Because Alonso, he was having a great time in the Grand Prix. Lance Stroll, different story. This was the data I showed you guys yesterday on the medium compound. Just wanted to share as well, because some of you guys were interested, the hard compound, just because I was having the discussion on was Verstappen really cruising? Because if he was cruising to the line, you might expect lower tyre degradation than this. Verstappen actually had on the harder compounds some of the highest deg in the entire field. The biggest difference here, and grain of salt with this data, because Alonso had negative tyre degradation, and there's reasons as to why that might be the case, slowing down to let Piastri in the DRS, management in certain ways that allowed him to push harder at the end of the Grand Prix, stuff like this, and, dirty air and other factors do affect this data. But the biggest gap was between Alonso and Stroll, obviously by a mile. The other biggest gap, though, really between two teammates here across a lot of the data set, I guess you can look at Magnussen and Hülkenberg, but Norris and Piastri, I think this is a storyline to keep your eyes on, because it was the same story on the medium compound as well, because I think Piastri is a very good driver, and he had a stellar rookie season last year, especially given the fact that he only had the proper upgrades for the McLaren later on in the season. But nonetheless, he is a year into his campaign now as Formula 2 champion a couple of years ago. He's now a few races into this year's campaign as well. And, the question about Piastri has been, he's clearly got the pace. Circuits such as Qatar last year, when there was no tyre deg because they had all of the pit stops were mandated, so it was just drive flat out the entire time. You don't have to manage the tyres or anything to that effect. He was rapid around those particular circumstances, and there have been weekends where he's been straight up better than Norris. And Norris is very good, and I rate him highly as well. But now is about the time where Piastri has to start showing some improvement, I would say, because so far this season he has been, I wouldn't say underwhelming, but certainly in Japan, Norris was very close to pole position, only a couple of tenths away. Piastri was further back, and then Oscar, of course, finished P8 in the race, where Norris was further up the field. And that's been the discussion in the media today, that actually, the difference between Norris and Piastri is in the tyre management side. Experience there is needed, and I think he'll get there, Piastri, but, we'll see how quickly he gets there, because there was a feeling this year that, wow, maybe Lando and Oscar this season's going to be a real, nip and tuck between the two of them. Piastri's going to make big progress, and it's going to be quite the internal battle at McLaren. Well, we're not seeing so much evidence of that so far in the races, because the tyre deg is still a problem, it seems, for Piastri, and the data would indicate that as well. Mercedes also struggle with tyre deg. I mean, their car was just pretty bad, and to be fair, it was heavy at the start of the Grand Prix when they were on the hards, and the other teams were on the mediums, generally speaking. So when the car's heavier, slides around more, you're going to have worse tyre degradation. And Toto Wolff says, yeah, we've got to do things differently to what we did in the past. That also applies to the driver selection. So read between the lines there in terms of whether he is planning to put Andrea Kimi Antonelli in the seat, because that is the present rumour. And actually looking at last year to this year, this is the data so far in terms of which teams have moved forward and which teams have moved backwards. Some teams, the teams that have like 0 points, don't have much difference. But the teams that actually do tend to score some points, Ferrari are nearly 60 points up at this point compared to where they were last year. McLaren, the same story, but, their car was shocking last year until Austria. Red Bull have actually gone backwards, but that's largely because of these other guys taking a step forward. The biggest losers are Aston and Mercedes. So with the exception of Red Bull, bit of an outlier just because of the way last season began. Those two Mercedes-powered cars are the biggest losers, but yeah, McLaren, another Mercedes-powered car, are one of the biggest winners as well. But the FIA have been doing a questionable job for a very long time now of managing this sport from a regulatory perspective. Even the drivers have made it very clear that doing a sprint in China is not a good idea. Now, I said yesterday, this is probably a deliberate strategy. We've not been to China for 5 years. Much has changed since then. This is kind of towards the end of Sector 3 and down that long back straight. Giving the teams 1 hour to have practice, then straight into qualifying, then the sprint race and everything like that will probably create some chaos and mix up the order to some extent. Teams are going to need to be well prepared, and whichever team hits the ground running the best and earliest will probably be in the best position. Are we watching Ferrari this weekend? Because after Australia, during the Australian Grand Prix, for example, this was said in the media that they arrived to the track with the best car on the Friday, and it took Red Bull a good couple of days to figure out a setup that was respectable, and even then it wasn't even that good in Australia with respect to the Ferrari. So the feeling was that Ferrari are actually the best prepared team. Their simulations or whatever matches up the best with what they see on track, so they can turn up on the Friday. And what was reported was that if it had been a sprint race in Australia, they'd have been winning 1-2 hands down, no problem, because they hit the ground running the best by a mile. So we'll see if that reflects in China. But it's like, how do you prepare the cars for China? Like, you don't have any data how these type of cars perform on this particular circuit. It's a lot of guesswork. It's going to be very interesting. But that's not the only questionable decision that Formula One and the FIA have made over the last couple of years. And this is when, once again, we get into the topic of aerodynamic, but also most certainly engine regulations. Over the last 15 years or so, the push in 2014 towards the hybrid units was because that was the way things were going. The electrical component, the battery, that's what the big manufacturers wanted to look into, wanted to explore, wanted to innovate in, and that's why, frankly, we got those electrical components. For 2026, as it was decided quite some time ago now, it's going to go even further. The feeling was at the time from the manufacturers and from the sport that it made more sense to push even more so into the electrical components, having the engines be 50% internal combustion power and 50% battery power from a hybrid pack, battery, electric engine, motor, generator unit, whatever you want to say. However, as we get closer and closer to 2026, I think many are realizing, not just fans, but also manufacturers as well, that maybe this isn't the best idea they've ever come up with. Even other sports as well, such as the World Rally Championship, they've ditched the hybrid units. They're going back to purely combustion, and sure, there are other problems that have been mentioned in the WRC lately, but nonetheless, the point still stands that getting rid of these hybrid-esque engines, this is the 2014 style hybrid engine we've had in the sport for some time, and this is the comparison here from Craig Scarborough between the 2022 style engine and the 2026 style, with the relative power of the internal combustion engine and the battery pack that is attached to it. Is this a good idea? I don't think so. I've said this for a very long time, and I'm far from the only person to say this, that I would love to have a world in which the cars were once again smaller, lighter, nimbler. The problem is, in my opinion, with the batteries in general, they're very heavy, and maybe the technology at some point gets to a point where the batteries are light enough that actually this technology makes a fair bit of sense. And while on paper, sure, yeah, it's good for the environment and all this type of stuff, the reality is that's not necessarily so clear. And even from F1's perspective, if they're trying to promote this whole idea that, oh, we're such a green sport, 50% electric and all of this so they can say their nice carbon neutrality numbers, then we're doing, 24 races a year. We're still flying these crazy routes between nations. Like, if they drop the number of races from 24 to 22 or to 20 or even to 18, I'm sure that would have far more severe consequences on a good way for the environment than it would doing all this shenanigans, which honestly contributes to ruining the racing as well, because the cars get heavier, the cars get larger, and because the cars are heavier, therefore they have to have more protection for the drivers from safety side, and therefore they get bigger and they get heavier. And this has happened over the last decade and a half pretty much, and it now leads to a point where the cars today look not much like the cars from back in, let's say, 2005 to the 2008-ish era, when if you look at pole laps from back then, if you look at anything, the cars look so agile, they look so nimble, the racing just looks so much better, and I would love to get back to a time like that. I think eventually we will, and the step that could be argued, and as Kurin Chanak actually says right here, I think it was actually in this tweet, for the past few years I've been saying that I wish 2026 would go to a V10 non-hybrid car on sustainable fuels. I really hope we get there eventually, but it doesn't seem to be 2026. Maybe it'll be the next set of regulations after that. But my feeling is that some of the decision makers here, they probably realize this is what they should have done now, and they are, well, the ship has sailed effectively. They've gone down this route, and they have attracted the likes of Audi, the likes of Honda, by this process. And it's not just an FIA thing, it's not just a Formula One thing that they're making their decisions for their own reasons. It's also that the manufacturers, at least at the time, to try and attract these guys in, Honda back into the sport, Audi of course into the sport, was like, yeah, look, we're going to work really hard on this hybrid section of the car. That's going to be great for you guys. You want to push hard on electric and all this. And even now, maybe the organizations are thinking, well, does this really make that much sense? Smaller, lighter, noisier, more challenging cars. Road car companies are now investing in internal combustion engine programs again. FIA seems to have missed the boat with F1, in my opinion. Completely agree with Kurin on this one. And as he goes on to say, the reality is that because these engine regulations are so complicated and have so many caveats and, repercussions in the way they're going to be designed, the aerodynamic component therefore has to be designed in parallel with this, as it always does, but to a more severe extent. And therefore, due to the weight and due to other factors, there is going to be active aero for 2026. That is the intention of the regulators, and the rumor has it today that it straight up doesn't work, according to the simulations. As we dive into this, what I thought was remarkable really straight up is that but how has this not been determined already? Like, these regulations are starting start of 2026. In just a few months' time, the teams, I think it's the 1st of Jan next year, something like that anyway, where the teams are going to be allowed to start developing next year's car. So, you know, they've got to get this working quickly and very prompt indeed. I thought they would have had this finalized in terms of the aerodynamic and the engine regulations, you know, 99% certain before this season even began. But no, here we are in April, not far away from when the teams are going to start designing their car for 2026, and the cars just simply don't operate as intended. So this is the issue. You've got this big battery, very heavy, and as a result, to make the characteristics of the car better and slightly more nimble, slightly more agile, slightly lighter, these are the things they want to try and achieve, and apparently they will achieve, but whether the car's already good or not, that's a question. The idea is that the car's wings will be able to run in a high downforce configuration in corners to help deliver grip before shifting to a low drag configuration on the straights to help boost straight line speed. We already have movable aero, active aero, in the form of DRS, but that's all there is, right? The DRS tab opens, then it closes, and that gives you extra straight line performance if you're within 1 second of the car in front, as we all know. However, it is possible to change the wing, let's say the rear wing, actively to generate more downforce in the corners, less downforce in a straight line, and therefore improve performance overall. It even might be possible to do this such that instead of DRS or in addition to DRS, but I guess, you know, DRS drag reduction system, this might just be an alternative even if it's not a flap that opens, but maybe if you're, you know, within a second of the car in front, you are allowed to move your, you know, rear wing in a certain way and the car in front isn't or something. I don't know. I hope that DRS isn't a thing really come 2026. I'd love to go back to the days where it's not necessary, but that's wishful thinking, I think, let's be honest at this point. However, with some teams having recently been evaluating what is known as the baseline Fangio car model, so picture like a car that Fangio might drive, just a really base model car, they've been driving it in the simulators and trying to figure out whether this is actually going to work. According to sources, when the rear wing is in its most low drag configuration and the engine was at full power, the car was almost undrivable, with multiple examples of drivers spinning on straights under acceleration or being unable to take the smallest of curves without the rear stepping out. This was triggered by a shift in aero balance that was estimated to be 3 times as much as is currently experienced when DRS is open. That is a big deal, because if DRS is, well, applied accidentally on especially the current model of cars, but even the previous generation pre-ground effect, that has a big impact, and 3 times more is a massive deal. One insider even suggested the only way to prevent the car spinning was to drive so conservatively that the lap times ended up being slower than current Formula 2 machinery. And F2 machinery is on certain tracks, I mean, I want to say 10, 12, 14 seconds slower than Formula 1 cars. So we're talking dawdling around the circuit to make these cars actually work. This is just an example of what potential issues this might cause, right? I saw Bryson Sullivan talk about this a while ago now, and he mentioned it again today. This is Marcus Ericsson with a faulty DRS at Monza back in 2018. He comes down the straight, you can actually see where he brakes right here, so you can see the car is kind of lurching forward, and this light comes on for the energy recovery, but the DRS stays open accidentally, okay, car fault, and guess what happens? Loses the aero balance that he requires and bang, spins out straight into the wall, right? So this is the risk when you have active aerodynamics that fail or do not work as intended. This, if you guys recognize this track, of course, is Jeddah, Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Imagine you're going through sector 1 with a car that is barely drivable at all. The rear always wants to step out because for some reason the configuration between the rear wing setup and the active aerodynamics that is in play is not giving the driver the performance they expect. This is the risk with active aero. You do this type of stuff, you're opening the door to massive potential inconsistencies, even if in the first place the car actually works as intended. I cannot imagine being an F1 driver going through sector 1 at Jeddah with active aero where the rear of the car is looking to step away at any moment. There would be crashes every single corner of this entire Grand Prix if this is actually what happens. So they go on to say that the FIA has recognized, yeah, okay, this actually doesn't work at all. So they've got to find another solution. And to be honest, I thought they were going to do this anyway. I thought there were rumors that they were going to do this anyway, but now they're saying that, well, instead of just the rear wing active aero, we're going to have to do the front wing as well, so they can work in parallel conjunction with each other to deliver those performance characteristics. So they say, well, it'll be fine. You know, we'll have the front wing, which can also move around, and therefore that's going to work with the rear wing, and it's going to be fine. But it's like, guys, the clock is ticking, you know. We ain't got that long to figure this out. Only a few months until the teams start developing these cars. And the plan, I guess, with only the rear wing being the active aerodynamic piece was that it would be less complicated, right? And therefore fewer moving parts and surely better. Now, do you want me to trust the FIA that they're going to come up with an appropriate set of regulations where the front and rear wing are going to appropriately interact with each other by changing their configuration during the course of a Grand Prix and during the course of a lap and even during the course of a corner so the drivers have a stable platform to work with? I don't know if I have faith on that one, I'm not going to lie. And I don't know if the teams will have either, because the simulator says the drivers tend to feel, yeah, these cars are hopeless right now. It ain't going to work. But as I say, they're in too deep at this point, right? They can't just say, all right, guys, yeah, you know what? These engines, they probably are a bit of stupid. They're probably a bit too heavy. Let's scrap them, and then we can go back to an ICE on sustainable fuels, and that'll be the plan. And then we'll have so much more leeway to work with an actual decent aero package. But no, they can't do that. They've gone too far. And, maybe they've flown too close to the sun like Icarus on this one. So very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comment section below. But they need to find a solution, and they need to find a solution pronto indeed, because otherwise the teams, the engineers, the drivers are going to be thinking, what the hell is going to go on in 2026? Because they gassed up big time the 2022 regulations. They worked for a good few races. 2026, though, on this evidence, might well be an absolute unmitigated disaster. So very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.